For 8 years he had lived alone, conversing only with the wind and his horses. However, 10 Apache ladies showed up. Tobias Redmond would have to make the most difficult decision of his life at his gate that stormy night, pleading for refuge. Due to they could immediately smell the smoke coming from his chimney from the men who were hunting them. The rain beat down on the bullet-like wooden shutters. Every rainfall serves as a reminder of why good people stayed indoors when the weather became unruly. When the knocking began, Tobias was sitting by his fireplace, sewing a bridle that had seen better days, not the courteous tap of a neighbor. The sound of people who had nowhere else to go was urgent and frantic. He froze, leather still in his grasp. His ranch was deserted, no more. Not after he'd made Tobias Redmond's disinterest in the world outside his fence line was evident. The knocking continued. More difficult this time, with voices in a language he knew but hadn't heard in years. His blood, Apache, grew icy. His wife and daughter were still alive when he last heard that tongue. When did strangers last interact? Arrived to his door during the night. In the morning he had buried everything he held dear. Instinctively his hand went to above the mantel. The gun was mounted. Memory of muscles from sleepy evenings while one eye was open? However, something stopped him. Perhaps the speaker's tone, rather than demands or shouts of war, was what made it sound almost like begging. Perhaps it was the way their words, broken and frantic, were carried by the wind. Or perhaps it was the understanding that warriors often did not knock to announce themselves. With each step, he moved closer to the thick oak door. Measured and cautious. He could hear them better now through the dense wood. The voices of women speaking quietly, urgent voices. One voice stood out above the others, delivering English with a distinctive accent that gave each word a distinct sound. Fashioned out of stone. We know you're there, please. We require shelter only for this evening. Feeling their words vibrate through the wood, Tobias put his palm on the door. 8 years of he had learned to trust his intuition from solitude, and all of my instincts were screaming danger right now. Not from the females, from whatever had brought them to his door in the midst of a storm that might kill a man in a matter of minutes rather than from themselves. He recalled how Sarah used to chastise him for having misgivings about strangers, and how she would declare that compassion was all that set them apart from the animals. However, kindness had perished with Sarah on a morning when he had placed his trust in the wrong individuals. The voice returned, this time nearer the door, as though the speaker had she buried her face in the wood. They're on their way. We shall perish out here if you do not assist us. Then, when they discover you will also perish, along with our bodies, at your gate. Tobias's palm lingered over the iron bar that held his door in place. In 8, he had never taken it off for anyone in years, but there was something in that voice, a conviction that made his stomach turn. Informed him that everything will change tonight because, somewhere in the shadows outside his ranch, riders, the iron bar was drawing near, and once they got there, there was no turning back from the life he had created in the darkness, felt heavier than it ought to have. After 8 years of rust and anxiety, Tobias eventually removed it from its brackets. Appeared to oppose his choice, but the anguish in her voice had pierced his barriers like the door creaked open, presenting a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life. A blade through paper. 10 Apache women gathered against his porch. Some with wounds that were visible, their traditional garments dirty and damaged. The youngest, who couldn't have been older than 16, clutched a bundle that painted dark spots against the damp fabric. The oldest had silver threads through her black hair and shifted slightly, a baby barely breathing in the cold. Eyes that had witnessed too many deaths, but his focus was drawn to the woman who had spoken through the door. Despite the fatigue, engraved into every line of her body, she stood a little apart from the others, her chin up. Her clothing was ripped at the shoulder and blood dripped from a cut over her left eye, but her eyes met his. Without flinching, she said, "My name is Ayana," using careful yet clear English. We've been going for 3 days, my sisters, my daughters, my people." Tobias, he opened his mouth to speak, then shut it, wondering why they were alone. Where they had come from, some things mattered, but he halted when he saw the baby's pallid lips. What kind of men were after them? Greater than responses. Come in, he heard himself say, backing away from the doorway. They moved swiftly like Tobias had forgotten the cramped feeling of his house with other people, moving past him into the warmth of his main room, people in it. It had served as his stronghold and haven from a world that had stolen everything for 8 years. Now it appeared to shrink in the presence of these women who carried with them the scent of fear and rain, among other things. Ayanna was the last to arrive, and as she walked past him, she remarked in a voice that was not quite their own, a bloody smell. The troops who hunt us are not far behind, perhaps an hour or less, and their voices are little more than a whisper. Won't stop until we're all dead. Tobias shut the door and replaced the bar. Understanding that it was probably pointless now, his refuge had been violated voluntarily, and there would be repercussions. He turned to Ayanna and said, "There always were. Why are they?" He recognized a familiar sadness in her dark eyes, the sight of someone who has lost everything as if she were stalking you, and survived to tell about it. Because we chose to live when they expected us to, because we chose to run rather than die quietly. Since some of us retaliated when they set fire to our hamlet and killed our men, we must embrace death. Ayanna's jaw tensed as the woman's arms produced a feeble sound, and one of their policemen would not witness the grief. When Tobias heard what he had done to my youngest sister, he felt a chill go down his spine. He had known such as soldiers, men who donned uniforms but had lost their sense of dignity, men who stole what they desired and killed everyone who might subsequently talk about it. "How many are coming?" Under the direction of a commander, he inquired. 8, maybe 10. Morrison, who claims we are hostile and has been chasing Apache villages for months, yet his true adversary is anyone who could expose his true nature. Tobias walked over to the window. He looked through a break in the shutters at the storm-lashed darkness outside his fence, but he saw nothing move. However, that didn't really matter because skilled murderers knew how to move covertly, especially when they believed their victim was imprisoned. He looked back at the women gathered around his hearth, some of them dressing wounds while others, who appeared to be survival rather than warriors, consoled the youngest of them, although he had long since discovered that sometimes a guy had to become somebody he had never intended to be in order to survive. "There is a cellar beneath the kitchen," he said to Ayanna, "with its stone walls and secret door. It could contain all of you, but it will be cramped." She slowly shook her head. "If they find us, you will perish with us. If they discover an empty, we won't turn you into an adversary. If your residence has indications that people were around, they might think you weren't participating." Of the U.S. Army, Tobias nearly chuckled. It was 8 years too late for that discussion. Lady, I turned against them. The day I made the decision to move on from what they had done to my family. The only thing left to consider is whether we will run or make something flared in Ayanna's eyes as she said, "They pay for coming here." Surprise, acknowledgement, perhaps even hope. The storm was waning outside. In the distance, barely heard over the dying wind, came the cover that had kept them safe thus far. The sound of mudslides and the hushed words of men who believed they had cornered their prey. Like a death sentence, the sound of coming horses sliced through the storm, and Tobias moved with the efficiency of a man who had managed to stay alive by planning ahead and retrieving his gun and ammunition box from the cabinet. But when something stopped him cold when he went back to the women. Ayanna was no longer the frantic refugee who had pleaded at his door. She now stood with a different stance, her shoulders straight and authoritative, and she held a knife that shone with light other than fire. The other women had changed as well, some of them holding weapons. Others positioned themselves with the practiced ease of those who had concealed themselves beneath their ripped dresses, had battled before. "We never were," Tobias murmured, knowledge rushing through him. "You are not helpless," he continued. "But sometimes it is better to let go," Ayanna said, her voice as steely as the steel she was holding. "Men believe what they want to believe. According to Captain Morrison, he is pursuing scared ladies who will cower and plead. He's going to discover otherwise. The baby's mother, the youngest, went to the rear of the home without being informed, and two other people trailed behind her. They had prepared for this situation and understood what they were doing. Tobias became aware he wasn't taking in desperate refugees. Warriors he was harboring had been engaged in a longer game than he had. "I got it." His question to Ayanna was blunt. "How many men have you killed?" She looked shamelessly into his dark eyes. Sufficient should understand that Apache women have been undervalued by Morrison troops before. Although they won't be the final ones, they might be the most taken aback. The voices outside became more distinct. Through the downpour, men were coordinating and calling to one another. Their methodology. At least 6 different voices, if not more, were audible to Tobias. Professional soldiers, but they were working in unfamiliar territory. They were hunting prey they had entirely aired. Tobias repeated, "The cellar," but Ayanna shook her head. "We sprint now, and they will always follow us. We hide, and they seek till they discover us. However, the hunting will stop if we wrap things. Up here tonight?" Something touched Tobias that he hadn't 8 years of experience. When it came to survival, the icy clarity that preceded violence removed everything except the necessary tasks. It was no coincidence that these women had visited his ranch. They would selected this terrain, this evening, and this tempest. They understood exactly what they were doing, therefore they had brought their fight to his door. He used to be that kind of dude, he said. "What do you need from me?" As keen as her blade was Ayanna's smile. "Morrison, Captain anticipates discovering defenseless women. He will find us instead. However, when his troops spot they will pause if they see a white rancher fighting with Apache. They will lose everything as a result of that hesitation." A horse gave a nicker. Outside, heavy boots splattered through the mud near the house. There was a person moving about the structure, organizing their attack and looking for exits. They would be inside in a matter of minutes, anticipating cowering victims. Tobias made sure a bullet was chambered in his rifle. In the back of his mind, Sarah's words reminded him he believed that their generosity set them apart from animals. But he was learning to be kind, wearing the face of when the only thing separating good from evil was violence. "There's more," Ayanna stated, silently. "If we make it through this, you can't stay here. Morrison's passing will raise concerns, inquiries. They'll come seeking clarification." Tobias gave a nod. As soon as he had opened his door, he knew that 8 tonight, years of tranquility were coming to an end. Perhaps, however, it was the way it was meant to be. Perhaps some males weren't supposed to be hidden from the planet for all time. An authoritative, haughty, and confident voice resounded over the storm outside. "I am aware of there you are. Let's get this done quickly. So come out immediately." Now that Captain Morrison had come, he was going to learn that the hunter becomes the prey in some hunts. Tobias stood in front of the window, and Ayanna and 3 more women dispersed across the main room, unseen by the dying fire's shadows. The remainder, in order to confuse any attack, ladies had merged into the back of the home, forming several lines of defense. They were a well-organized war party that had been organizing this conflict for a long time, not desperate refugees. "Days! Rancher!" Morrison thundered once more. "We are pursuing dangerous fugitives. Please open this door." Imagine harboring American adversaries. Tobias could see things moving in the dark through the shutters. Darkness, with soldiers dispersing throughout his home and occupying positions that would hinder his ability to flee. Strategies, but they were acting erroneously, believing they were encircling a cabin full of scared ladies and perhaps one empathetic rancher. Ayanna emerged next to him, moving so quietly that he didn't hear her coming. "He's Sergeant Blake," she murmured, "the one by the barn. Corporal Hayes, the one by your well, was present when they executed my husband. He restrained my sister. While Morrison, she didn't need to finish the sentence." Tobias sensed a familiar and ominous surge, and these weren't troops. It was the same icy fury that had kept him going during his 8 years of seclusion. They were now uniformed predators who spoke just one language. "How would you like to proceed?" Morrison, who always wants to see the horror in his victims. "Eyes will enter through the front door," he said. will enter by the sides and back, but they anticipate finding a rancher as well as ladies who are too scared to fight. She gave him a small mirror that was polished to shine because she was afraid. He wouldn't resist. When you notice the indication, take Morrison. The rest will be taken care of. Tobias was going to inquire about the signal when a fresh voice broke through the commotion. Not like the severe orders they had been receiving, young and unsure. "Captain, sir, perhaps we should just search." The Morrison's laugh was unattractive. Maybe it was simply an elderly rancher weathering the storm. "Private, those footprints lead directly to this door, Wilson. 10 ladies are inside, bleeding in at least 3 places, moving quickly. And if anyone is foolish enough to assist them, we do it by the book, my book." Tobias heard the distinct sound of whatever was going to happen. It was occurring right now. Weapons getting ready, safeties clicking off. If you were Tobias, what would you do? Try to talk to men who have already made the decision to kill everyone inside or trust by opening the door. Which side are these Apache ladies who had transformed his sanctuary into a battlefield? Please let me know in the comments. You decide. Because Tobias's next decision would decide whether this night was one of justice or murder. Morrison smashed in the front door, his rifle ready, and it exploded inward. But instead of finding confusion, flared for a moment as he found himself looking down the barrel of Tobias's Winchester at terrified women over the captain's face. This wasn't supposed to happen. Ayanna only needed that moment of uncertainty. A signal to positions across the house was reflected by a mirror that sparkled in the firelight. The storm that had the noises of what came next, the whisper of swords, finding their targets, were muffled by the soldiers' concealed approach. The moist sounds of justice being administered with Apache steel, the muted grunts of men who died before they could shout. Morrison realized he had fallen into a trap, and his eyes widened, but it was too late. Tobias's Ayanna came behind the captain like a shadow before he could fire. Despite his finger tightening on the trigger, shape, with surgical precision, she slipped her blade between Morrison's ribs and said, "This is for my sister," in his ear. Morrison dropped his rifle with accuracy, his hands gripping the wound, but Ayanna wasn't done yet. She wanted him to, for every woman you believed was too weak to defend herself. See her face to learn who had delivered him justice. However, a new sound, more horses, more voices came to them through the rain as Morrison fell. Morrison hadn't there alone after all. Reinforcements were coming from somewhere in the shadows, and the actual conflict was just getting started. Tobias's blood froze at the sound of reinforcements coming. Through the shattered doorway, he could make out torch flames flickering in the shadows. Morrison had been the most advanced of at least a dozen riders. The actual army was just getting there, so Ayanna withdrew her blade from Morrison's chest, her party, not the entire force. Terrible visage as she took in what they were saying, and her women emerged from the shadows all about the house like ghosts, each of whom verified Tobias's pre-existing knowledge. Morrison's initial team was dead, but how many seconds had passed since their victory? Ayanna inquired the woman who appeared next to her. 15, possibly 20, riders heard the gunshot. They are aware that something went wrong. Tobias experienced the well-known burden of undefeated decisions resting on his shoulders. Either fight to the finish or give up and die more slowly. Yet as he gazed, he recognized that there might be a third choice after these women transformed his haven into a battleground. Demanded that he return to the guy he was before his sadness had made him a recluse. "The Stormeller," he said swiftly, "not to conceal, but to endure what follows." Ayanna shook her head. "We cannot flee from this many. They're going to pursue us over 3 different areas." "We're not running," Tobias said, approaching a cabinet that he hadn't opened in 8 years, which contained items he'd hoped he'd never have to touch once more. Fuses, dynamite, and the implements of a guy who had previously destroyed a mountain. "My ranch sits on a hill," he said. "I built railroads on the sides and later other things when the war had called for it." Sod, his hands mechanically preparing charges. "Both sides have natural drainage. All of that water must go somewhere when the spring floods arrive." Ayanna's eyes began to clear. Tobias nodded and said, The dam. I designed it to minimize floods but remove it during a storm like this. He pointed to the oncoming torches. In a matter of minutes, that valley fills with 10 feet of water, and anyone trapped there perishes, Ayana completed. However, we would be demolishing your house and your property. Tobias surveyed the cabin that had been his 8 years in prison, after which Morrison's body cooled on his floor. Home wasn't a location no longer. It was a decision, and he decided to ensure that these women survived to witness the grieving. He repeated what Sarah used to say when he had been overly fixated on material possessions: matter more than property. Items outside, voices were growing louder, commands were being yelled, and positions were being taken. Someone had discovered. By now, Morrison's body had noticed the blood and realized that their simple targets had changed completely. The infant, who had somehow slept through the violence, was awake when the youngest woman arrived with him. "Lieutenant Morrison has passed away," a voice says, dark eyes wide and alert as if sensing the tension that filled the air. Shouted. Outside, "Give up now or we'll burn you out." Ayana turned to face Tobias. "If we do this, there's no turning back. You'll be a wanted man for the rest of your life," she said, her expression unreadable. Life? Tobias scooped up the ready-made charges and shoulder-rode his weapon. "Lady, I've been dead for 8 years. I'm choosing to live again tonight." However, just as they were about to exit through the rear entrance, a fresh sound interrupted them. Cold, a baby's cry, not the one they're holding, but another one somewhere. And because sometimes the deadliest monsters hide behind the storm, one of the soldiers had taken a youngster along. The most innocent shields. The decisions that test a man's willingness to go to great lengths to save the people are the most difficult. Who are most important? Tobias paused halfway to the rear door when he heard the distant baby's cry. The dynamite suddenly, Morrison's. Hands felt like lead. Torchlight flickered across Morrison's torso through the shattered front entryway. Beyond that light, an innocent boy found himself enmeshed in a conflict that had nothing to do with it, might be a ruse. Ayana took hold of his arm, her hold iron firm. Such devices have been employed by soldiers in the past, but Tobias shook his head, having heard too many actual cries throughout his life to misjudge the sincere fear in that little voice. Someone had brought their own, most likely one of Morrison's men, out there, child on what they thought would be a straightforward murderous mission, and now the child was going to cover their father's sins. "With a baby down there, we can't blow the dam," he whispered softly. One of the other ladies muttered, "Then we all die." She was correct. My daughter's life is just as important as that one's. Tobias had been pacing the edge of that line for 8 years, and he understood that once a boundary was crossed, it changed a man permanently. "There's another way," he murmured, putting down the years. And tonight he either retreated or slipped off entirely. Explosives, more challenging and risky, but it keeps everyone alive. Ayana's eyes narrowed. "Tell me, we give them the impression that we're stuck. Give them too much confidence and they'll make guys flush?" He paused and said, "Whoever brought that baby that leaves us out while the rest stay back with the horses?" Outnumbered 3-1. "This won't be fair, but it would be in a fair combat." Shifted to a separate cabinet that had objects that spoke to a different type of conflict. Cowrips, iron tripwires that might snap a man's neck in the dark, spikes made for horses, and bear traps that had never been used before a bear, but throughout the conflict I had tasted human meat. 8 years ago, I was terrified of dying, so I turned this building into a fortress. Tonight, we'll employ those fortifications to ensure that other people live. Voices were organizing outside. Someone was assuming leadership, Morrison's second, most likely. They had numbers and training, but they were also receiving orders and being allocated locations. Tobias knew the earth like his own heartbeat, working. "In the dark, how do we split them?" Ayana inquired. "We give them what they anticipate. Make noise, barricade the front, make a last stand, and give the impression that we are desperate and besieged." Then Tobias grinned. "Half of their force will come for us, and the other half will stay back to secure the retreat route." And it wasn't a nice look. Next, we demonstrate to them the distinction between fighting and hunting scared ladies, individuals who had nothing left to lose. The strategy was straightforward, cruel, and totally crazy. Ayana and 4 women would generate enough commotion at the front of the home to distract Tobias, and the other women would loop around through terrain that only he knew as he drew the attack squad, aiming for the reserve troops and, ideally, rescuing the infant. If this doesn't work out, Ayana stated as Morrison's passing won't matter. They will portray us as barbaric killers and utilize our bodies to justify 10 more raids. That baby out, Tobias said, if we don't do anything. You all die for the crime of desiring to live, and there dies for its father's misdeeds. In such cases, the only option is the baby's wail sounded again. And if you're enjoying the story, please subscribe to the channel. Weaker now, Tobias felt time passing through his fingers like water, and each moment they postponed was another minute that would haunt him if he lived through this night, another second closer to a child's murder. Move, he muttered. Tobias led the others into the storm as Ayana and her group positioned themselves at the front of the home, via his back door. Although the rain had lessened, the ground was dangerous and one slip would alert the troops' flanking maneuver. But as they slipped through the shadows, they heard horses and whispered immediately. Tobias became aware that he had made a crucial mistake in judgment. The infant was not part of the reserve force. Walking between the two groups would be necessary to save the child because it was considerably closer to the house. The infant's cries were coming from a cart that was situated between the home and the crossfire, main camp for soldiers. Tobias could see the outline of a military camp as he approached through the muck and darkness. Supply wagon. Next to it, a woman who wasn't a soldier's wife was bent over something little and moving. She was wearing a camp follower's shabby clothing, likely that of a cook or Larry's who had been compelled to carry her infant on what should have been a straightforward mission. Tobias motioned for the Apache women he was accompanying to remain in place as he approached. He could hear the woman's frantic whispers through the rain as she attempted to soothe the wailing baby. Stuck in the between of two forces that are about to meet, with nowhere to flee and no means of shielding her child from what was the noise of Ayana's distraction, came from the house. Gunfire, yelling, the sound of furniture toppling over. It was functioning. Tobias could make out soldiers approaching through the shadows. The home, leaving the supply area with minimal security, which nonetheless had 3 armed guys ready to kill anything that moved, he decided. Tobias stepped out of the shadows and headed straight for the wagon, his rifle held low, but as soon as he saw him, the closest guard raised his weapon. But Tobias yelled in a voice that Lieutenant Morrison instructed me to secure the civilians, and the lie bought him peace. Easy, soldier. Precious seconds. In his dark coat, he could appear to be military from a distance in the confusion and darkness. Tobias was close enough that shouting would not draw attention to either of them by the time the guard realized. His error desired, the soldier responded. You're not army, but his tone was one of doubt rather than terror. No, Tobias concurred. The soldier fell silently into the mud after striking the man across the temple with his rifle butt. The woman with the infant, who was younger than he had anticipated, perhaps 19, looked up as Tobias drew closer, fear shining in her eyes, with the lifeless expression of someone who had endured too much adversity in her lifetime. Please, she muttered, don't harm my sweetheart. Nothing has been wrong with her. Neither have you, Tobias muttered. What's your name? Mary. Mary, Hendricks, I prepare meals for the men, wash them. It would be safe, Captain Morrison remarked. Stated that we were only going to capture 3 ladies who had stolen horses. Morrison had deceived his own people, and Tobias felt a burning rage in his chest. The man continued to demolish, turning a chef and her infant into unintentional murderous collaborators, even killing them, life. Mary, I'll get you out of here, but only if you follow my instructions properly. Are you able to do that? She gave a nod. There will be more shooting in a minute, she said urgently, holding her infant closer. When it begins, you dash in the direction that tree grove and continue running until the sound of the weapons is no longer audible. Downstream, follow the creek. It results in a trade post around 5 miles south. Tell them Tobias Redmont sent you. What about you? She. Sod. Prior to Tobias could respond, the other guards noticed him. One raised his firearm and the other yelled a caution. However, the Apache women who Tobias had placed in place were already in motion, stepping out of the shadows like avenging ghosts. The battle was short but decisive. These troops had anticipated encountering terrified refugees rather than seasoned combatants who'd been spending days plotting their retaliation. The supply area was secured in a matter of minutes, and Mary Riss was encountering the night with her infant, vanishing into the storm's protection. However, their triumph was fleeting. A fresh sound emerged from the direction of the home. Something worse than gunfire, quiet. Either Ayana's team had prevailed entirely, or they had all perished. And ascending above the storm that was dying, afresh with icy power, the voice shouted out, "Colonel Bradley from the U.S. Army is here. All around you is a complete troop of soldiers. We'll burn you out and hang the surviving if you don't surrender now." Tobias's blood began to change to ice. In the end, Morrison had not been the true leader. A far more frightening adversary lurks there in the shadows. Had been waiting, observing, and allowing others to die while he positioned his troops to deliver the final blow. Colonel, the assurance of a man with all the cards was evident in Bradley's voice. Tobias could make out torches through the shadows, dispersing throughout his property in a broad radius. Instead of the dozen bikers they had initially encountered, what appeared similar to an entire military campaign. They had all fallen into the trap, and Morrison had been the bait. However, as Tobias, he heard something that altered everything. As he absorbed this new threat, the voice of Ayana calling from the direction within the home. "We have Bradley's son, Tobias." The ensuing quiet was deafening, as though nature itself was anticipating how this would play out. Even the storm appeared to pause. Next, Bradley's voice repeated itself. However, it now conveyed a tremor that was previously absent. "Let the boy go, and we can talk about the terminology." "No terms are used," Ayana returned the shout, "just justice. Your men killed our families, ruined our village, and worse. You will now be held accountable for their offenses." Tobias moved toward carefully navigating the landscape, which was now a labyrinth of warriors and positioned guns, back toward the home. As he drew nearer, the scenario became clearer to him. The battle had been won by Ayana's troop, but at a price. In the muck, the Apache women lay still. The others were given a chance at survival because of their sacrifice. Within the home, he discovered a scenario that, just an hour before, would have been unthinkable. Ayana positioned herself behind. A youth in her knife was pushed against his throat in the lieutenant's uniform. The youngster, who was only a boy, possessed Bradley's the same aristocratic jaw and eyes. However, the boy displayed only fear when his father exuded icy power. "He entered through the back," Ayana said softly. "He flanked us, thinking he was being cunning, while his father's the front was attacked by men. Rather, he brought himself to us." When the youthful lieutenant attempted to speak, Ayana's a small line of blood was drawn as the blade moved closer to his skin. Tobias questioned the boy. "How old are you?" 19, the reply was murmured. "The cook's daughter, who was the same age as you, ran into the night after your father turned her, same age as some of the women your captain killed." Tobias took a step forward and examined the boy's face. "Tell me, Lieutenant Bradley, did you know what Morrison was really doing to those villages?" The young man's gaze wavered between Ayana and Tobias. Finally, understanding is emerging. I believe that we were putting down hostile Indians. Father claimed that we were defending settlements and that they were raiders. Your papa lied," Ayana whispered. "Before Morrison arrived, we were living in harmony. We reared kids and grew crops without bothering anyone. However, non-combative? Indians don't support military spending, do they?" Bradley's voice echoed from outside, now more desperate. "This residence is surrounded by 60 men. Let my son go, and I'll allow you to cross the territorial border safely." Tobias nearly burst out laughing. Safe travels from a man who had based his career on fabricated conflicts and unfulfilled promises. However, he noticed something as he glanced at the youthful officer that made him think. Sincere surprise and mounting terror as the youngster realized what he had been involved in. Tobias told Ayanna there was another way, not one that necessitates his demise. By association, he is guilty. He is not absolved by ignorance. No, however, his father might be found guilty based on his evidence. As he spoke, the notion solidified. The testimony of a colonel's son regarding systematic murder under false pretenses of military service take action. Bradley's career would be ruined, and the corruption that had allowed individuals like Morrison to succeed would be revealed. "You desire me to turn on my dad?" the young lieutenant muttered. Tobias answered, "I want you to tell the truth. The question is, are you man enough to confront the implications of that truth?" A fresh sound cut before anyone could react. All through the night, horses charging forward at full speed, accompanied by voices yelling commands that weren't Bradley's men. There was another on the way, someone powerful enough to unnerve a full colonel. By way of Tobias could see new torches through the splintered door. Riders in various uniforms carried this. Federal marshals or territorial investigators, perhaps? Bradley's efforts had been observed by someone, and the carnage that took place tonight had ultimately attracted official notice. Tobias came to the realization that they might all make it through this after all, but there would be a cost to existence. Justice would have to be done, the truth would have to be spoken, and strong men would have to go down. Between his captors and the incoming troops, young Lieutenant Bradley glanced, then gazed. The sword remained pressed against his throat, reflecting his own image. He muttered, "What do you need me to say?" If you enjoy the tale, please subscribe to the channel. 6 hours later, dawn arrived at Tobias Redmond's property, painting the sky in crimson and gold hues that seemed fitting for a night that had brought an end to one type of conflict and begun another one more. With increasing horror, the FBI investigators had listened to Lieutenant Bradley's account, recording crimes that involved officials all the way up to the territorial level and extended much beyond Morrison's unit money. They brought Colonel Bradley away in chains. His military career was ruined by the bravery of his own son to speak the truth. Federal protection and compensation were provided to the remaining Apache women for their defeats, despite the fact that money couldn't bring their deceased relatives back. Tobias stood in his destroyed house, seeing Ayanna as she gets ready to go with her people. Mary, the Apache child, and the infant they had rescued despite the awful toll on other lives. Hendrik's daughter had made it through the night. "Where are you going?" Ayanna was asked. "North to family members who managed to avoid Bradley's campaign. We won't rebuild here, but we will. This location there's too much blood now." She took a moment to examine his features. "How about you? Your house is demolished." You were no longer alone. Tonight, the man who spent 8 years living alone passed away. Tobias gave a nod. She was correct. Someone who had remembered that some things were valuable had taken the place of the reclusive hermit. Worth living, worth dying for, and worth fighting for. He said, "I think I'll go west," stated. "Look for a place that requires a man who can construct things and isn't scared to stand up for them." Ayanna grinned. Her smile was the first sincere one he had ever seen. "Mary Hendricks, the chef, will require security until she gets to her. Relatives in Denver? For a single lady with a newborn, the trail is risky," Tobias comprehended. His first masculine act reborn would be making sure others achieved theirs safely, not rushing toward a new life. The Apache women were riding north. As the sun rose higher over a ranch that had seen too much, Tobias got ready to go west toward atonement and hope. Just enough justice and a lot of dead. At times, the conclusion of one tale marked only the start of another. And occasionally a man who believed his life was over found that he was only beginning. After several years, travelers would recount the night that 10 Apache ladies and a lone rancher defeated an army. Those that experienced it, however, recognized that the reality was more nuanced and straightforward. The most difficult decision isn't always between right and wrong, and incorrect, but between being human and being safe. Additionally, occasionally when the being human is the only thing that truly matters and choice is what matters most. Click the video on the screen now to listen to this narrative is even better, but it has a dramatic twist that you won't soon forget. Select the video.